Treatise on the Reintegration of Beings by Martinez de Pasqually. God, having created for his own glory, in his divine immensity, spirits distinct from himself, so that they might practice the worship that this divinity had fixed and prescribed for them by immutable laws, eternal and unalterable precepts and commandments. These first spiritual beings created by God were all created free and independent of the Creator as to their spiritual will and action. They were thus, by this means, created with their free will. This cannot be believed otherwise without destroying the faculty, the property, and the personal virtue of the first created beings, whom the Eternal had emancipated from the bosom of his divinity, so that they might operate with precision within the boundaries that had been given and assigned to them by the Creator to be at their sole disposal and power. It was positively in these places that these first spiritual beings were to render to their Creator the worship they owed him and for which they had been created. These beings cannot deny their covenant with the Creator. They received laws, precepts, and commandments. It is by these very laws that they subscribe to this great covenant, receiving it immediately from God with satisfaction. I will ask, what were these first created beings before their divine emancipation? Did they exist or did they not? They existed in the immensity of the Creator, but nevertheless without distinction of action, thought, or individual understanding. To exist in this way is not to exist at all, because one can act and feel only through the will of a superior being, by whom everything concentrated within him can be moved, and have understanding and action only through him who contains the whole within himself. He would not be Creator without the infinite reign of beings who are innate within him and whom he emancipates by his sole will, and when it pleases him. It is this multitude of infinite emancipations of the spiritual beings within himself that gives him the name of Creator, and of divine, spiritual animal, and spiritual temporal creation. Who, then, are these first created beings whom the Eternal emancipated from himself, and how did he distinguish them? By their names, virtues, and powers, which were superior to any being created after them. They were superior because they immediately occupied the immense divine circumference which is commonly called domination, the first divine circle bearing its denary name, as follows from the figure. The name of these first spirits was more powerful than what we call cherubim, seraphim, archangels, and angels. These four denominations of spirits assure us that their emanation truly comes from the quadruple divine essence in which every created spirit, whether major and superior 10, inferior 7, or minor 4, was to act and operate for the greater glory of the Creator. These first four principles of created beings had within them a part of the divine domination, a virtue of major, inferior, and minor power. They had within them all these things and the knowledge of those that could exist or be enclosed in these different spiritual beings, since they were not yet created and emancipated from the bosom of the divinity, because these first chiefs, emancipated from the Creator at the first divine circle, mysteriously named the denary circle, read distinctly and with certainty what was happening within the divinity, as well as what was contained within itself. There must not be the slightest doubt about what I say here, being fully convinced that it belongs only to the Spirit to read, see, and conceive the Spirit. The first spiritually created chiefs were thus extensively clothed in divine virtue and power. There is no doubt that these spirits foresaw every divine action, the divinity having created them to be face-to-face witnesses of all these divine operations and of the manifestation of its glory. Have these divine spiritual chiefs always preserved their first state of divine virtue and power? Yes, they have preserved it through the immutability of eternal gifts and decrees. For if God had withdrawn all the primary virtues and powers which he bestowed reversibly upon these first created spirits, there would no longer have been any action of good and evil life, nor any manifestation of glory and divine power superior to the major, inferior, and minor spirits. Will it be said to me that the Creator must have foreseen that this creation of spirits would prevaricate and depart from the laws, precepts, and commandments he wished to give them? If he foresaw it, why did he not keep them in their first state of justice toward him? I will answer that, although the Creator foresaw the proud ambition of these spirits, he could not restrain them in any way without depriving them of their individual actions, which were innate within them, they having been emancipated from the divinity to act of their own free will as a spiritual second cause according to the plan for which the Creator had created them. Will I be asked again, what is the nature of the prevarication of these spirits that could have induced the Creator to use the force of divine law against these first spirits? I will answer this question that the Creator takes no part in spiritual second causes, whether good or evil, having himself founded every created being upon immutable laws, and by this means every created being is free to act according to its will and its particular determination, which can operate as it pleases, just as the Creator himself said to his creature, and of which we see confirmation every day of our lives before our eyes. I will say further that if these spirits were created only to act upon second causes, why did they wish to exert themselves and act upon divine first causes, instead of remaining within their inviolable promise of action and of second agent? Since they were second causes, they should have been jealous only of their second power, virtue, and operation, having been created and emancipated by the Creator solely for this purpose, and not so that they might occupy themselves with anticipating the thoughts of the Creator in all his divine operations, whether past, present, or future. Such conduct on the part of these first created chiefs was criminal before the Creator. In what way could it be criminal? First, in that they wished to seek means to condemn the divine eternity. Second, in that they wished to seek another means to limit the divine omnipotence in the operations of creation. Third, in that they directed their spiritual thoughts toward wishing to be creators of the third and fourth causes, which they knew to be innate within the omnipotence of the Creator, whom we call the quadruple divine essence. I will point out to my disciple the criminal will of the first created spirits against the Creator. They condemned the divine eternity in that they wished to give the eternal an emanation similar to their own, regarding the Creator only as a being similar to themselves. Consequently, there were to be born from them spiritual creatures who would depend immediately upon them, just as they themselves were to depend upon him who had created them. This is what we call the principle of spiritual evil, being fully convinced that any evil will conceived by the Spirit is always criminal before God, even if the Spirit has not realized the content of its evil will in actual action. I will say, therefore, that it is from this first criminal will that the first spirits were cast down, by the sole power and will of the Creator, into places of subjection, deprivation, and misery impure to their spiritual being, as pure and simple spirits relative to their first emanation, as will now be explained. These first spirits having committed their crime, the Creator asserted his immutability with the force of law by creating this physical universe with the appearance of material form, to be the fixed place where these spirits would act and exercise all their ill will in privation. One must not include in this creation man, or the miner, who is today at the center of the earth's surface, since man was in no way to make use of this matter in any apparent form, having been created by God only to be a being powerful over every being created before him, as is about to be explained. God having created by his omnipotence this universe to be the refuge of the first perverse spirits and the fixed place of their evil operations, which could not prevail against the laws of order he gave to his universal creation, the Creator created, after all things, a man to whom he gave the same precepts, laws, and commandments that he had given to those first created spirits. Though, being second, he became the firstborn and superior to the first by his state of glory and his fidelity in fulfilling the commandments he received from God. This last created being perfectly knew the origin of his spiritual creation and the necessity of the universal creation. He also knew the usefulness of his spiritual creation and the glorious form that had been given to him to act with all his will upon active and passive corporeal forms. It was within all this form of glory that he was to manifest all his power for the greater glory of the Creator, in the face of the universal, particular, and general creation. We shall distinguish the universe into three parts to make it understood by our disciples with all the faculties of spiritual action. The universe is an immense circumference in which are contained the general and the particular. The general is the earth, from which emanates all the nourishment necessary to sustain the particular, and the particular is composed of all the inhabitants of celestial and terrestrial bodies. This is the distinction we make of the universal creation, so that our disciples may know and operate with distinction and full understanding in each of its three parts. Adam was therefore, in his first state of glory, the true emulator of the Creator, since he read within the Creator when he worked his divine thoughts face to face with him. He therefore made him conceive the three principles that compose the universe he had created, and to this end, he said to him, "Command all active and passive animals. They will obey you." The creature obeyed what the Creator told him, and Adam saw thereby that his power was great. This is precisely how he learned to know with certainty a part of the whole composing the universe, after he had operated upon what we call the particular, which is composed of every active and passive created being inhabiting the earth's surface and its center up to the celestial center, which is mysteriously called the heaven of Saturn, above which is the supercelestial. After this operation, the Creator said to his creature, "Command the general or the entire earth, and it will obey you," which the creature did. He saw that his virtue was great. He knew, after this operation, with certainty the second whole composing the universe. After these two operations, the Creator said to the creature, "Command the created universe, and all its spiritual inhabitants will obey you." Adam again executed the word of the Eternal, and it was through this third operation that he learned to know the universal creation. Adam, having thus operated and manifested his will according to the Creator's pleasure, received from him the august name of God-man of the universal earth, because there was to come from him a posterity of God and not a carnal posterity. I will point out that, by means of the three operations that man performed according to the pleasure of the Creator, he then received the laws, precepts, and commandments. At the first operation he received the law, at the second the precept, and at the third the commandment. These three kinds of operation, which the first man performed according to the pleasure of the Creator, clearly show us not only the limits of power, virtue, and strength he had given to Adam, but also those within which he had bounded the first spirits created before him. The Creator, having seen his creature satisfied with the virtue, strength, and power that were innate in him, which he could use at his will, withdrew from him, to let him act according to his free will, which he had given to his creature through the emancipation he had granted him, detaching him in a distinct manner from his divine immensity. And this so that he might have the faculty of personal, particular enjoyment, present and future, for an impassable eternity, provided, however, that the creature acted according to the will of the Creator. This creature, whom we call Adam, being left to his free will, reflecting upon his great power manifested by the great strength and virtue of his first three operations, envisioned his work as almost as great as that of the Creator, yet he was unable on his own to fathom perfectly these first three great operations in relation to those of his Creator, despite having received the express order to do so from him before he was left free to exercise his will over all that was under his dominion and in his power. Adam's reflections, as well as the thought he had conceived of reading within the infinite power of the Creator, did not take a moment to become known to the first created spirits. For the very instant Adam had imagined this thought, one of the principal perverse spirits, whom we call evil intellects or demons, appeared to Adam under the most beautiful form of apparent glory, and, having approached, said to him, "What more do you desire to know of the Creator? Has he not placed in you all virtue and power equal to him? Act and operate in your capacity as a free being, all your innate will, whether upon him or upon the entire universal creation that he has subjected to your power and command. You will then learn to be convinced that your power differs in no way from that of the Creator. You will also learn to know that you are not only a particular creature, but also a Creator, just as the Creator told you that a posterity of God was to be born of you. It is from the Creator that I hold all these things, and it is for him and in his name that I speak to you." At these words of the demonic spirit, Adam remained inactive and felt a violent turmoil arise within him, which threw him into an ecstasy. And, in this state, the evil spirit suggested to him all his demonic power, which by this means left an impression of his will upon Adam, who, having returned to his spiritual animal ecstasy, consented to operate the demonic science against that of the Creator and against that which the Creator had given him to subject every created being inferior to him. Adam, prepossessed and persuaded by the demonic thought, preferred it to the particular spiritual science, which he completely rejected, in order to make use only of that which the evil spirit had suggested to him. Adam therefore operated the demonic thought, performing a fourth operation in which he used all the powerful words that the Creator had transmitted to him for his first three operations, although he had entirely rejected the rules of those same operations. He made use, by preference, of those which the demon had taught him, as well as the suitable plan he was to execute to attack the immutability of the Creator, according to what the perverse spirits had conceived to execute in order to forestall the Creator, to the detriment of the laws the Eternal had prescribed for them to serve as boundaries in all divine spiritual operations. These first spirits were to conceive or understand nothing in matters of creation, being merely creatures just like Adam, who was no more to aspire to that ambition, which was inappropriately suggested to him by the demon, of wishing to strive toward the creation of spiritual beings. No sooner had these perverse spirits conceived of acting out their will to create in imitation of the Creator, than the Creator suddenly cast them and their ambitious thoughts down into places of darkness and divine privation for an immense duration of time, they being condemned to this abode by the immutable will of the Creator. I would have my disciple observe that this condemnation to such punishment by the Creator clearly shows that he leaves no criminal thought of any spirit unpunished, since the Creator cannot be ignorant of the thought and will of his created being. Thus, it is the good and evil will that goes directly to make itself heard by the Creator, who receives or rejects it. It is therefore not, as several people have wished to claim, that evil came from the Creator, just as all created things emanate from him. Such a judgment is impious and erroneous. From the Creator has come forth every spiritual being, good and indeed sound and perfect. No evil has emanated, nor can emanate, from him. But should I be asked whence evil came, I would say that evil is engendered by the Spirit, and not created, creation belonging only to the Creator and not to the creature. Evil thought and evil will are engendered by the evil spirit, just as the superior, sublime, and good thought given to man is engendered by the good spirit. These kinds of engenderings of good and evil thoughts, and of wills for and against man, emanate immediately from good and evil spirits, leaving man to receive the one or the other according to his free will, which gives him the right to claim the reward promised by the Creator for his good works, as also to remain for an infinite time in the privation of his spiritual right. I will say further, regarding the origin of evil, that evil does not originate from the Creator, nor from any of his particular creatures. But I will say that the origin of evil comes very positively from the evil thought and evil will of the Spirit, or from the thought and will opposed to the laws, precepts, and commandments of the Eternal, and which cannot change in that spirit without destroying its freedom or its individual existence, as has been said above. Not that the spirit which engendered evil is evil itself, for if the demons changed their evil will, their actions would also change, and from that very moment, there would no longer be any question of evil in the entire universe. Will you reply to this that God, being immutable in all his decrees, has condemned to privation in eternal torments those who have engendered evil? I will answer that it is true that the Creator has condemned him who is the professor and who professes evil to an infinite privation and sufferings. But I point out that at the center of the manifestation of the Creator's justice upon the creature, he has named himself the Father of boundless mercy toward this very same creature. I shall go no further in examining this infinite mercy of God, reserving to speak of it in another place. I will therefore return once again to the engendering of evil occasioned by the evil will of the Spirit. I will say then that the evil engendering of the Spirit, being nothing other than the evil thought from which results the will spiritually called the evil intellect, just as the engendering of the good will is also called the good intellect. It is through these kinds of intellects that these good and evil spirits communicate with man and leave any impression whatsoever upon the spiritual mason, provided, however, that the will of him who has the power to reject or to admit is willing to lend itself to receiving the one or the other, in his capacity as a minor being, free in his first principle of creation. We distinguish the good or evil will of spirits by the name of intellect, because they operate upon spiritual beings created after them, and because these first created spirits have degenerated from powers superior to those of the minors only through their prevarication, which subjects them to minor creatures. I make no distinction between the subjection in which the minor or man holds the good spirits, and that in which he holds the evil spirits under his virtue and power, as I will make my disciple understand. When the Creator had created the first mason, after having created the darkness or the earth, where the professors of the evil intellect were to dwell, he said to his man that he had created all things below the supercelestial heaven for him, and that everything was created to be subject to him, and that he had only to command to be obeyed. He therefore had the power of command over the demons in privation. The good will of this first mason, or of the minor clothed in his body of glory, would have been to these spirits a good and true intellect, which would have made itself felt by him, just as the evil intellect made itself felt by the first mason, and which, through his prevarication, is still felt even down to us. By the power of command that he had over the demons, he could by his good will have confined them even further in their privation by refusing them communication with any being created after them, as is represented to us in nature by the inequality of the 5 fingers of the right hand, of which the middle finger represents the soul, the thumb the good spirit, the index finger the good intellect, while the other 2 fingers represent the demonic spirit and intellect. We shall understand very clearly by this figure that man, or the minor mason, was solely created to remain always in the presence of the evil demon, to contain him, combat him, and keep him in a greater privation of communication with any good spiritual being. The force and power of the minor were far greater than those of the demons he was to contain under his power, in that the minor had in his possession those of his companion and his intellect, which he united with science, and by this means he could make three good powers struggle against two evil, demonic ones. And in this way, he would have put an end to the professor of evil and to evil itself. It can be seen, from all that I have just said about the professor of evil, that the origin of evil arose from no other cause than the evil thought, followed by the evil will of the spirit against divine laws. Not that the spirit itself, which emanates from the Creator, is directly evil, because the potentiality of evil has never existed in the Creator. It is therefore a great error to admit into the possibility of divine things the evil that arises solely from the disposition and will of the creature, and not of the Creator. Those who speak otherwise do not speak with knowledge of the facts regarding things possible and impossible to the divinity. When he chastises his creature, one attributes to the Creator only the name of justice, and not the name of the author of the scourge he casts upon the creature to try, by this effect, to preserve it from infinite torments and punishments. I will now enter into the explanation of the prevarication of Adam, or of the first minor mason being created after the first spiritual and prevaricating beings before him. I will say, to this effect, that the prevarication of the first created mason is a repetition of that of the first spirits. It is so because the inspiration of his prevarication, though departing from his own will, does not come immediately from his own thought, this thought having been suggested to him by those first prevaricating spirits. The force of Adam's prevarication is even greater and more considerable than that of the first spirits. This is so, not only because Adam retained the impression of the counsel of the demons who led him to resolve to contract his evil will in favor of their demonic advice, but also because he went so far as to employ all his will, virtue, and divine power against the Creator, something those first spirits had not had the time to do, their evil thought and will having been read by the Creator, who immediately struck down their desire in this regard. It will be asked why the Creator did not use his power against the evil will and the iniquitous operation of Adam, as he had done against that of the first perverse spirits. To this I shall answer that, as the Creator had created man, or the minor, to be the instrument he would use for the complete punishment of the first spirits, he allowed the laws of order that he had given to both of these two created beings to subsist, and watched them operate according to their free will, in accordance with their thought, desire, and will innate within them. The Creator, being an immutable being in his decrees and his spiritual gifts, as also in what he promises and refuses, as well as in the rewards and punishments he inflicts upon his creature, according as she knows she deserves it by her actions, left these two created beings to act of their own will, it not being for the Creator to read within secondary causes, as I have already said, and still less to prevent and arrest them. He could not do so without departing from his immutability, thereby derogating from his own existence as a necessary being and from his divine power, as I shall make my disciple understand. If the Creator took any part in secondary causes, he would of absolute necessity have to communicate thought and will himself to both the good and the evil creature, and have it communicated by his spiritual agents who would emanate immediately from him, which would always come to the same thing. If the Creator acted in this manner, you would be right to say that good and evil come from God, as do the pure and the impure. Things being so, you would no longer need to consider yourselves as free men, subject to any divine worship of our own will, since we would have none due to the lack of liberty. Let us therefore render all the justice that is due to the Creator, remaining more than certain and convinced that there has never existed in him the slightest suspicion of evil, which cannot even be conceived, the thing not being possible, and not even being within divine possibility. What demonstratively proves the truth of what I say is that, if it had been within the power of the Creator to arrest secondary causes, he would not have permitted his minor, or his first man, whom he had created to be the sole operating being for the punishment of perverse spirits, to fall prey to the demons, having expressly created him to be the particular instrument for the manifestation of his glory against these spirits. I will make another brief comparison on this subject, although there is none to be made. I will propose to you, for example, if you sent a second self to fight and overthrow your enemies, and it were in your power to make him return victorious and triumphant over them, could you let him succumb without succumbing yourself? If, on the contrary, your envoy only marches against your enemies to fight them under the immutable laws you had prescribed for him, he will return triumphant if he followed them in every point, and you will reward him with all your power, as a friend faithful to your orders. But if he succumbs, having transgressed these same laws, you will punish him as holding the power in your hands. This deputy having finally succumbed, have you suffered his fate? No, he alone is blameworthy, and upon him your indignation must fall, considering him as an object of disgrace, a deceiver, and a perjurer to himself. I will say then in this regard, if your deputy had received your orders to fight your enemies, and if, instead of attacking them to overthrow them according to your laws, he joined with them to attack you and make you their subject instead of their being yours, how would you regard this deputy? You would regard him as a traitor, and you would be on your guard against him. Well, this is precisely, by the comparisons I have just made, the prevarication of this first man, or created minor mason, against his Creator. It is on this subject that it is said in the Holy Scriptures by the angel of the Creator, "Let us drive out from here the man who has knowledge of good and evil, for he might trouble us in our purely spiritual functions. And let us take care lest he attack or touch the tree of life, and thereby live forever." The tree of life is nothing other than the Spirit of the Creator, which the minor unjustly attacks with his allies. Lest he live forever means lest he live eternally like the demonic spirits, under their same cursed virtue and power. I will further observe to my disciple that, if the first minor mason had remained concentrated in his first crime and had not obtained reconciliation from the Creator, he would have remained a minor of the demonic minors to whom he would have been subjected, whereas, on the contrary, the minor was restored by his Creator to the same virtue and power he had previously possessed against the infidels to the law. It is therefore by this reconciliation that the minor received a second time from the Creator virtue and power for and against every being, so that he might use it with wisdom and moderation, and no longer strive in the future to employ his free will and his desire at the pleasure of the enemies of the Creator, for fear that he might thereby become the tree of life of evil, living forever under the same demonic virtue and power. I will return to the prevarication of Adam, and I will say that, having been created by the Creator to be destined to produce a posterity of God and not a posterity of matter, as he brought about of his own will, it is not surprising that such a crime on his part should be punishable from generation to generation for an immemorial time. If you knew the nature of Adam's prevarication and the fruit he received from this same prevarication, you would not be astonished at the punishment the Creator inflicted upon us at birth, making it devolve upon our posterity until the end of time. Here is the principle of the evil operation of the first man. Adam was created last of all creatures whatsoever, and at the center of universal creation, general and particular. He created him free, creating with him the law that was to contain him within his boundaries of spiritual power, just as he had done for the first perverse spirits. Adam, in this first state of glory, conceived very well that he was something more than any created being. He felt also that he had within him a power above all angelic beings, relative to the office for which the Creator had destined him. He was to act with superiority over all beings. Adam, having reflected upon his first state and being unable to define or act by himself upon things that were not within his power, as I have said elsewhere, carried out his will, following the thought inspired in him by the principal demonic chiefs, and operated upon this same thought in the center of his first glorious estate, commonly called the earthly paradise, and which we shall mysteriously call the land elevated above all sensory perception. This site is thus named by the friends of wisdom, and it was upon this Moriah that Solomon's temple was built, which truly figures the creation of the first man. To be convinced of this truth, one must observe that Solomon's temple was positively constructed without the aid of tools made of metals, in order to show all men that the Creator does not employ the material physical in his operations. This glorious bed in which the Creator placed his first minor mason was figured by 6 or 7 circumferences, through which the Creator represented to the first man the 6 immense thoughts he had employed for the creation of his universal lodge, that of his mason. The last circle, joined to the first 6, announced to the mason the union that the Creator's Spirit made with him to be his strength and support. But despite the precaution the Creator employed to warn his first mason against his enemies and his own, man did not fail to act according to his own will and pursued his operation against the Creator, as he knew and determined by his impure work. Adam had within him an active creation of a posterity of spiritual form, that is to say, of a glorious corporeal form similar to the one he had before his prevarication. This glorious form would have been impassible, and all the glory of this creation would have been given to him directly by the Creator. The Creator having joined his divine operation to that of his spiritual minor, the two of them would have made but a single operation. The will of the first man having been that of the Creator, no sooner would the thought of the Creator of glorious forms have operated than the divine spiritual thought would have acted, immediately fulfilling the operation of the minor with a being as perfect as himself. It was in this great work that Adam would have seen himself reborn with satisfaction, since he would have been the true creator of a posterity of God. But Adam did not act as I have just said. He acted to the contrary, and I am going to explain it to you. Adam, being led into error by those in whom he had placed all his trust, by the lively solicitations they made to him at every moment, and by the false plan of an apparent divine operation they had drawn up for him, through the advice these same demonic spirits would give him, saying, "You have innate within you the word of creation of every kind. You are a professor of all value, weight and measure, number and power of divine creation. Why do you not operate what is innate within you before those who are outside of you, who will render you all the justice that is due to you? We are not ignorant of the fact that every created being is subject to you by the Creator. Operate, therefore, as a creator of creatures." Adam, filled with the pride of his counsel, traced 6 circumferences in likeness to those of the Creator. That is to say, he operated 6 acts of the spiritual thoughts he had in his power to cooperate with his will of creation, which he executed physically according to his counsel, to the detriment of the Creator and of himself. He manifested his proud power, his spiritual power, in the presence of his evil counsel, who was, as he was, surprised by the little success he derived from his operation, which he believed to be equal to that of his Creator. But it fell far short, for instead of having operated a creation of glorious form, he created a dark form entirely opposed to his own. He thus created a woman of matter, instead of creating one pure and natural, as it was in his power to do had he operated according to the will of the Creator. But what became of Adam after his operation? What did he do after having reflected upon his impure creature, deprived of a thinking and spiritual being? What did he understand of the iniquitous fruit of these operations, which he saw to be so imperfect? He saw his proud crime. He saw, therefore, that his heinous deed of prevarication had brought about the creation of his own prison, which would confine him more tightly within dark boundaries, in divine spiritual privation until the end of the ages of this universe. In what do we make this prison consist? In the change of the glorious form into that of an apparent and passive material form. Will I be asked if the corporeal form of glory in which Adam was created by the Creator was the same as we have now? I will answer that it differed in no way from that which men have today. Will I be asked again what this form of matter was that Adam created, and of what use it was to Adam for the Creator to have been so greatly angered against him? I will answer that the great anger God had against man was to see Adam, or his spiritual minor, defile himself through his prevarication in a form of impure and passive matter. Will I be asked, but of what use, then, did this corporeal form of matter that he created serve Adam? I answer that it served him to bring forth a posterity of man, and not of God. It is called a posterity of man in that, man having created the passive form, he degraded the impassive form the Creator had given him so that he might cause to emanate from it all those in which the Creator had inserted spiritual minors, to be a true posterity of God, which would have subsisted without limits and without end. This society would have been immortal and impassive, because the operation of the first minor would have been that of the Creator. In this way, the will of the two operations would have been but one in two substances, that of the glorious body given to Adam, and that of the spiritual minor given to the divine Creator. I may be asked again why the Creator let the fruit coming from Adam's prevarication subsist, and why he did not annihilate it, since he cursed not only the whole earth, but also the first man. I will say that the Creator, wishing to afflict the first man from generation to generation for an immemorial time, let the iniquitous work of his first created minor subsist, so that he might always have before him, during his time of privation, the horror of his crime, and so that the crime of the first man would not be erased from beneath his heavens. The Creator allowed it to be perpetuated until the last posterity of Adam, so that they might not allege any cause of ignorance of the prevarication of the first temporal father of men, and so that they might learn thereby that these present pains, sufferings, and miseries, which this same posterity endures and will endure until the end of the ages, do not come from the divine Creator, but from their first father, the Creator of impure and passive matter. I will point out that the term impure matter, which I use here, must be understood only because Adam operated this form against the will of his Creator. I will be asked, but we do not know how the change of the glorious form that Adam had in his first state of justice of his perfection was made, and we do not know if the Creator gave Adam the body of matter that he had after his prevarication. I will answer, as soon as Adam had completed the accomplishment of his prevaricating will, the Creator, by his omnipotence, immediately changed Adam's glorious form into a form of passive matter similar to the one his horrible operation had produced for him, casting him into the abysses of matter from which he had drawn the fruit of his prevarication. And he then came to dwell upon the earth like the rest of the animals, whereas he previously reigned over it as a God-man, and inhabited it without being confounded with it. It was after this striking example that Adam recognized more vividly the force of his crime. He did not delay for a moment in groaning over his fault and asking God's forgiveness for his criminal offense. It was in the moment of his retreat, contrition, and lamentation that he invoked the divine Creator in these terms: Father of charity and mercy, life-giving Father of eternal life, Father, God of the heavens, of the gods, and of the earth. Strong and most strong God, God of justice, of punishment and reward, Almighty eternal, avenging and rewarding God, God of peace, clemency, and charitable compassion, God of good and evil spirits, strong God of the Sabbath, God of reconciliation of every created being, eternal and almighty God of the celestial and terrestrial regions, invincible God existing necessarily, without beginning and without end, God of peace and satisfaction, God of dominion and power over every created being, God who afflicts and rewards when it pleases him, God quadruple strong in the revolutions of the celestial and terrestrial hosts of this universe, God, sovereign leader of eternal spiritual privations, magnificent God of all contemplation of created beings and unalterable rewards, God, Father of boundless mercy in favor of his weak creature and toward him who groans before thee, over the abomination of his crime, not being the second cause of his prevarication, reconcile man in thee, and subject him forever under thy immutable law. Bless him once and for all, so that in the future he may become unshakable in thy law. Bless also the work made by the hand of thy first man, so that it may not succumb, as I did, to the most intense solicitation of those who are the authors of my just punishment and of that of the work of my own will. I will point out to my disciple, by this invocation that Adam made to the Creator to obtain his reconciliation, that it is positively Adam who was the first to give to his posterity this exact knowledge of the different virtues, powers, and properties that were innate in the Creator, so that this posterity learned thereby that it was created only to fight for the greater glory of the Creator, and that it might render him the worship for which it has been perpetuated in creation. I will further point out that the worship the Creator requires today of his temporal creature is not the same as that of his first created minor, when he was in his first state of glory. This first worship having but one purpose, because it was to be entirely spiritual, whereas the worship the Creator requires of his temporal creature, Adam's posterity, has a dual purpose, the one temporal and the other spiritual. This is what caused the prevarication of Adam, our first temporal father, in this life of tears and misery. I am not yet certain, you will tell me, of the nature of our first father's prevarication. It could not escape our physical animal, spiritual passive, and eternal sight without clashing head-on with the feelings and all the immense and infinite virtues that are inherent and innate in one another. I will therefore say on this subject, in order to make you fully conceive the nature of this prevarication, that we must go back to the first principle of the counsel and solicitation of the first cursed spirits to the first created God-man, whom we call Adam or Red Man, which means a God-man created very strong in wisdom, virtue, and power. These three things innate in the first created spiritual mason are the thought, the image, and the likeness of the Creator. These three most holy things are securely innate in the first created mason. Of this I can assure you. I will further tell you, so that you may be thoroughly convinced of the nature of Adam's prevarication, that you must know from whence derived his impure operation, the fruit of his operation, and his reconciliation. First, you must observe that the first act of thought Adam had did not come from him, as I have already said, but his will was directly from him in his capacity as a free being. Adam, having adopted everything relative to his evil counsel, put his pure, simple, spiritual divine will to use at the whim of his iniquitous demonic counselors, and he acted just as he had been told. Before entering into the details you ask of me regarding the nature of Adam's prevarication, I will also have you observe that it is necessary to know what can engender good and evil thoughts. Thought comes to man from a being superior to him. If the thought is holy, it comes from a divine spirit. If it is evil, it comes from one of the demons. Thus, all our wills and operations in this world are put into action by man only in accordance with the conception of his thought. I do not limit myself to this world alone and to men in general, but also to all the other worlds and all the spiritual beings who inhabit them, whether those whom the Eternal uses to communicate with his minor creature, or those for the manifestation of his glory in the entire creation of this universe. Will you ask me on this subject, where the princes of the demons and their demonic legions receive their thoughts, and why they do not receive them from the Creator, since every being is created and all emanate from him? I will answer to this that this entire demonic court received its condemnation immediately from the Creator, from the very instant of their prevarication. He further told them that there would be no change in them, and that he would place no limit on their actions, so that they might enjoy fully and entirely according to their thinking will, neither needing nor being able to expect any communication of divine thought, other than that which their own will would make them perform. It is therefore in this demonic court, in matters of laws, order, horror, and abominations, as it may be beyond comparison, in that of the divine spiritual court. The chief prince of the demons communicates his will to his demonic angels for the temptation and persecution of the created minors, whom he seeks to seduce and cause to succumb under obscure laws. Laws which he tries to make appear, to the one he wishes to seduce, as clear as those the Creator placed within his creature. I will point out to my disciple that any divine will that reaches us through the invisible communication of good spirits, or of a good intellect, must not be considered as a divine operating will, because any divine will that reaches us through invisible communication can only be considered by the one to whom it is communicated as a thought, and not a will. It is therefore as a consequence of this communication of thought, which we call intellect, and not as a will that man operates his own will. It is from this communication that the created minor degenerated from his faculty as a thinking being, by joining to himself either the good or the evil intellect, as I will explain. When Adam was in his first state of glory, he had no need of a good and evil intellect, since he read within his Creator, being face to face with him. He likewise read within the will of the prince of the demons. Adam was not, at that time, susceptible to receiving any will of good or evil spirits, being entirely thinking of the divinity. But when Adam was left alone to his own virtue, power, and free will, he rendered himself susceptible to good or evil communication, as Christ himself proves to us by the very demonic will that was visibly operated against him on Mount Tabor, where the demonic spirit tempted the Messiah in nature under an apparent human form. I will say, then, that it is the evil intellect that causes the evil will of the minor to operate against that of the Creator, just as Adam did when he prevaricated through an operation entirely opposite to that which was innate in him under his divine spiritual virtue and power. I will therefore enter into the true details of the nature of Adam's prevarication, as you desire, with the same certainty that was given and taught to me by one of my faithful friends and protectors of truth and wisdom, Adam, the first God-man of the whole earth and of every created being inhabiting it, really performed a terrible operation by creating a form in his own image and likeness of bodily form. However, this form was by no means glorious. It could only be a form of apparent matter, and even a very imperfect one, relative to the imperfection of the act of his will. This imperfect operation might perhaps have been less punished by the Creator had Adam not unjustly abused the great power the Creator had placed within him, and concerning which the Eternal had promised him under oath that he would act with him in all the operations he performed in his name, and would make him feel the certainty of his immutable promise in whatever circumstance he might need his help and support to consummate and crown his works. It was from this immutable promise that he proceeded to manifest the power which the Creator had given him, whether toward every created spiritual being and every being, to create for it an imperfect body, in favor of which Adam renewed to the Creator the immutable promise he had made him to come and crown his works. He commanded him, by his divine immutability, that he must fulfill the word he had spoken to him by his own pure will as Creator in favor of material creation. God, bound by the force of his oath and his immutability, could not avoid fulfilling his promise without detracting from his omnipotence as Creator, according to the immutable word he had given him to join his spiritual operation to Adam's temporal operation. Thus, the Creator followed Adam's operation, although it was contrary to his will. He acted toward Adam as he desired, and granted him the crowning of his first work, by enclosing within this form of matter a minor being, whom this wretched Adam subjected to a prison of darkness, and thereby rendered this pensive and thinking minor being susceptible to eternal or limited misery and privation. The word pensive denotes an intellectual junction to the minor being who, by his nature relative to his divine emanation, is a thinking being entirely within the immensity of the Creator, and the intellectual junction that intimately befell this thinking minor being caused this first being to degenerate into the subjection of always being pensive, through the intellectual notions, good or bad, that he receives from good and evil spirits, and of being only at times thinking through his complete junction with the Spirit. One must not be surprised if the first man, whom we call Adam, became a pensive being after his prevarication. The matter is quite clear, as I have already stated above. It should be even less surprising to his posterity that all minor beings created after him are such as he became at the end of his prevarication. Nothing proves what I say on this subject better than the different ways of thinking, acting, and operating among the posterity of this first temporal father. One can be convinced of this truth by the different nations, languages, divine and material cults, and the revolutions of the earth and of all the bodies surrounding it, which vary and will constantly vary as much as and in the same manner as the general and particular posterity of Adam until the end of time, relative to the places of darkness they inhabit, and this through the communication of that intellectual being by which man is surrounded, which causes this posterity of thinking beings, turned pensive, to mistrust the good or bad inspiration they receive, whether from the good or the evil spirit. This can also be proved by the exact and intimate communication that men have always had in the past and will have until the end of time, instructing one another in the thoughts they have conceived, whether tending toward the spiritual or the material. Nothing better proves the uncertainty, inconstancy, and doubt that this posterity has from its self-distrust, and this because of its premature advancement. I will point out to my disciple that there have been minor beings created solely by divine operation and will, and, although the form of these created minor beings, destined for the manifestation of the glory of the Eternal, was emanated from the posterity of Adam, The minor being who was inserted into this form was truly a pure thinking being, and there was in him nothing of the pensive being. And why is that? Because the Eternal manifested his own will to him through the vision of one of his deputies, who announced to him without. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.